So welcome to the Culture Decoded podcast. My guest today is General Sir Nick Borton, who I will run through his career in just a moment in terms of the highlights. But it's a very interesting moment to talk to Nick, not only because of what's going on in the world, but also that his last day in paid uniform was Friday last week. So we have a free and unfettered opinion at our hands. Nick, welcome.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
So Nick's background, and as I said, I'll give the highlights, or at least the headlines. Commissioned in 1991, commanded his own regiment, the Royal Highland Fusiliers, in 2008, awarded a DSO in Afghanistan in 2009, went on to command 16 Air Assault Brigade, which is the nation's readiness brigade or formation, in 2014, and went on to command the division, the 3 UK division, in 2016. And you've ended your career commanding the NATO's ACE Rapid Reaction Corps up until really earlier this year, all of which we're going to talk about. You retain being the regimental colonel of the Royal Regiment of Scotland and the colonel commandant of the Army Air Corps, which we will talk about a little bit, but to give you command of a helicopter later in your career is always a rash move, I think, but we'll talk about that. Why I was particularly interested to talk to Nick was that not only has he commanded at all levels of military command, from platoon all the way to corps level, which these days is actually very unusual, but you've also spanned various eras of military existence, in that you commissioned into what essentially was the Cold War, or you entered into the army in essentially what was the Cold War, followed by a period of relative peace up until 9/11, and then the 20-year era of operational cycle following 9/11, predominantly around Iraq and Afghanistan, although not entirely. And now we enter into what many people are calling a pre-war era. So that perspective across, in one organization, but across different eras and at different levels, allows us to pick at a lot of themes around organizational culture, leadership, organization design, and mindsets and attitudes within it that underpin it. So there's lots for us to pick at. Particularly, I'd like to start at your most recent experience, so the ACE Rapid Reaction Corps, which is a readiness formation for NATO, comprised, I think, of 23 nations. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
23 contributing nations. And you entered that role in 2021 prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, I took over the month before the Russians crossed the Ukrainian border.
And so let's start there. So to make it more recent and more immediate. So how did you see the effect of war visiting Europe in a real terms, if you slightly put a perimeter around what happened in the Balkans in the 90s, for the first time since the end of the Second World War? You must have not had a ringside seat, you must have been in the driving seat for NATO's response, and not only NATO's response to that, but the nation's response to that across Europe. So talk a little bit about your experience of that and how you drove change, what did change and what is yet to change in terms of how nations are viewing that.
Certainly. And you're absolutely right. My career has straddled a period which in effect has come full circle, as I started as a Cold War platoon commander in armour. Then we moved away from that and spent the long, hard years of counterinsurgency, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, Iraq, Afghanistan, and then sadly have come back full circle to the prospect of, what we call mass armoured combined arms manoeuvre in Europe. And the Ukrainians, of course, would say that they have been fighting the Russians since 2014, not since 2 years ago. But of course, it became more real then when they went into the unheld bits of the Donbass. And it has been a fascinating, if devastating, journey to be on and to be part of. I think we should be, as an aside, very proud of what UK forces and the UK government have done in support of Ukrainians. There's no question that we have led the charge on a whole range of areas in supporting Ukrainians, and that we should recognise and be jolly pleased about. I think the implications for NATO and European security cannot be underestimated. And there is no question that however the current very intense conflict in Ukraine works its way out, as inevitably it will at some point, and all wars end ultimately in negotiation. At some point it will finish one way or the other, or will settle down. But either way, the security laydown, architecture and environment of Europe is changed for another generation compared to what we grew up with, as we hit our military careers, Charlie, at the end of the 90s. And for NATO, weirdly, the person who has done more to cement NATO and bring it together as an organization is Vladimir Putin, which is exactly what he was trying not to do, of course. But being part of the NATO force structure over the last 2 years, albeit leading a British-led core headquarters as part of NATO, it has been very heartening to see the way NATO has come together with all of its challenges of being in a consensual organization with now 32 countries in it. Has been difficult to bring together, but NATO has responded extraordinarily well. And the one example I give to people, I think, which illustrates the importance of NATO and also underlines what a dangerous place we're in. If you take the Finns, who obviously were the most recent country to join, the Swedes were the most recent, Finns, but just before that. But those two came on board post the war in Ukraine, and I have done a lot with the Finns. I'm very good friends with the Finnish army commander. So the Finns, for the 75 years of the Cold War, i.e. since NATO was formed, concluded that their best interest was served by being neutral and treading a careful line between Russia and NATO, probably with a slight leaning towards keeping the Russians happy. And that was in their best interests for their security. Post the invasion of Ukraine, the Finns have concluded that almost universally that their best security interests are served by joining NATO after 75 years. That is a massive statement by a country that understands Russia and fought them twice in the last 100 years, better than anybody else.
Oh, and as you say, it's the opposite of what Vladimir Putin calculated as the outcome of his action.
Indeed. And of course, it just then reinforces his narrative, infamy, they've all got it infamy. So, I think that's a really telling thing that the Finns and the Swedes have come on board.
We're going to zoom in a little bit in a moment, but I want to zoom out because there's the wider arc going on, not just in terms of Europe. But I'm interested to know, particularly from your position from ARC, but more generally in terms of the perspective you have, there is a visible division appearing, which in the post-Cold War era and the era of globalization has been absent. In fact, noticeably the opposite of a division between what can maybe loosely and inaccurately be called liberal democracies and also inaccurately be called autocracies. Trade is dividing. Geopolitics is dividing. And there's a good, and probably it's unfair to be as binary because there's a significant number of countries who actually sit in the middle of that and in neither of those two camps, who, as Finland has done prior to joining NATO, sort of aiming to play both sides, some deliberately. But how does that play out from a geopolitical perspective from your view, Nick, which is, so this division, where does this lead us?
Yeah. Therein lies the crux, I think, more broadly, because sadly, I think we're in a much more dangerous and uncertain and unstable place than we were in the Cold War, because ironically, in the Cold War, there was actually a certain stability to that, because there were two superpowers, two blocs. All of those other countries across the globe generally were not in the same economic strength position that they are now. So little things flared up around the world, Korea, Vietnam, whatever it might be. But generally, it was the two superpowers facing off. They balanced each other out, and there was a sort of stability, and globalization was a phenomenon that was developing. Sadly, now I think we're actually in a period where globalization is unraveling.
Yeah.
And more and more divides are growing up across those blocks. And of course, those countries that 30, 40, 50 years ago weren't big powerhouses now are in their own right. Brazil, India, China, North Korea, clearly in the news at the moment. And you could mention numerous others as well. And so the game as it was to play out the Cold War in those other countries and influence is now that much more important because those countries are so much more powerful.
So more complex.
And more complex and not necessarily more democratic. And I think from a democracy point of view, and of course it's a year in which we're going to be talking about democracy or lack thereof quite a lot globally, there are some very worrying signs about the erosion of democracy after years of journeys, particularly those parts of the old British Empire, which steadily moved towards democracy. And now you begin to see some of those unraveling. I mean, India is a fascinating election result there, fascinating election result in South Africa. So coalitions now attempting to deal with that fractured result, the rise of the right in Germany, which we've now seen. These are all worrying trends which further undermine that stability, which, dare I say it, we enjoyed. There's a great line in one of the Bond films where Bond makes another howl up, and Judi Dench is furious with him and goes in for a massive ticking off from the Prime Minister. And as she comes out, she says, "God, I miss the Cold War." And you can see why, because we knew where we were in the Cold War, and people understood in the Cold War the mathematics of escalation. So we understood what they could do, they understood what we could do, we knew what the steps were, we could walk up those steps, and then we could walk each other back down again. And whether it was 2 fighter pilots over the North Sea, or whether it was missile forces in Europe, with the exception of 1 or 2 moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis, like Able Archer in the 80s, where things nearly went wrong, generally those escalation ladders worked. Now we've got many, many more players. They're not all rational players. And the proliferation of nuclear weapons makes the whole thing a good deal less uncertain than ever it was.
A trend towards disorder.
For sure.
And without trying to become too grand in our scope, I am interested in picking a little bit about, and particularly from your experience of leading the ARC, the role liberal democracies play in terms of decision-making, their values, their investment in defense, readiness to fight, clarity of decision-making, which of course is at the heart of at least one part of this divide. You're talking about a sort of trend towards disorder, but there are also sort of 2 axes, the autocracy versus liberal democracy. You were leading a formation of almost 24 contributing countries, most of them, maybe not all, liberal democracies.
Mm-hmm.
What's your sense of how well equipped politically we are for this next phase?
It's a very good question. And particularly as a soldier, it's very easy to look at autocracies who, of course, can channel their entire economic power without any discussion towards their militaries, as we're seeing Putin doing very successfully with the Russian economy, and extraordinary, maintaining the level of military power that he has done in the field, with no immediate sign of it or the economy faltering. Economists will be watching what happens in the longer term with the Russian economy more closely. But in the short term, if you're an autocratic state or a dictator, you can decide to have an army of 300,000 people and as many missiles as you want, and no one's there to argue. And by contrast, in a democracy like ours, where decision-making is slow, is conflicted, add that conflated with NATO, where you've got 32 countries all having a debate about how to spend their money and where to spend it, it can be frustratingly slow and seem deeply inefficient. But what I would say is, ultimately, I still think we're in a much better position, not least because we're doing the right thing by reflecting the will of our populations, but also because the strength of that alliance when it comes together is absolutely unshakable. And therein lies the absolute core of the whole NATO thesis. And that's why ultimately Putin would be very foolish to take NATO on, because it'll take us a bit longer to get there. But my goodness, when we do, as I suppose in World War II, when the new world came to the rescue of the old world, when the alliance comes together, the power it can bring is absolutely overwhelming. So for all its frustrations, as Churchill said, there's only one thing worse than fighting in a coalition, and that's not fighting in a coalition. And Putin notwithstanding a lovely trip to North Korea,
which is this week,
yes, as we speak, and getting some pretty poor quality artillery ammunition for his troubles. He's feeling pretty lonely, and North Korea pretty probably feeling pretty lonely too. Somebody said on the radio this morning, it's the loneliest bromance in the world because they haven't got any other mates. So I suppose my point is that notwithstanding the challenges of operating in an alliance like NATO, where you've got to get 32 consensus, ultimately we're still way better off because the mass that we can bring and the depth and the power and the economic power behind it, should we need to do it. The trick is doing enough of it now to make sure we don't have to fight a war. What you don't want to do is do what we did in 1939, is wait for the war to start and then start gearing up.
So let me use that as a stepping off point, if I may. Your observation how, particularly in the Second World War, it might have taken the alliance to take more time to come into action, but when it did was overwhelming. Use that as the link to talking specifically about the British Army and its organisation and its culture. The most recent Chief of General Staff, Patrick Saunders, talks a lot about a pre-war phase, and he was notably quoted as saying that wars are started, history has taught us that wars are started by professional armies, but they're finished by citizen armies, which is a stepping off point for us to talk about the positioning, but more importantly, the culture within the army in the UK and how that's evolving, how the leadership is not only seeking to track society in terms of being a servant of the society, but also lead the society on a development of its values and understanding of culture, but also the necessity for the future probably to fight. Be interested to hear that, and we can take different avenues down it. But how is the thinking evolving in that in Army headquarters?
Sure. So just to pick up on one point, as you mentioned, General Saunders' much quoted comment, and others have said it about, we're in a pre-war phase and this is a pre-war generation. I know why he said that, because he was trying to mobilise the government to invest in the army and to make up our war stocks for reasons I'll come to. I personally don't subscribe to the pre-war generation or pre-war phase terminology. I much prefer to say we're in the deterrence phase. If you say we're in a pre-war phase, then effectively you talk yourself into war. It's as the old Thucydides trap, or as Baldric said, we had a war because it was just almost too much trouble not to have a war.
Thucydides and Baldric in one sentence.
There we go. Whether Baldric ever read any Thucydides, I'm not sure. But the point is, you can talk yourself into it. And the whole point is, again, Cold War, it worked for 70 years. If we arm and train to a sufficient degree to demonstrate that he won't win a war, then we will deter him from starting one. If we bemoan the fact we're not prepared and say we're in a pre-war generation and it's inevitable and we'll be fighting the Russians in the next 10 years, and I see this for the Americans in the Pacific and China. I worry sometimes that elements of the US military are almost talking themselves into war with China. Then you almost bring an inevitability about it without necessarily unlocking it. So deterrence is what we should be focusing on. And you achieve deterrence through correctly arming, correctly resourcing your army and your armed forces, and clearly messaging what your intent is, which I think NATO does very well. But NATO relies on its participating nations, its member nations, in order to sufficiently fund its armies and armed forces to achieve the deterrent effect. If we do that, we'll prevent war, which I, for one, am extremely keen to achieve.
The prevention is maximised by the perception of lethality.
Yes.
And so that allows me another way to ask the same question, which is
back to culture.
But back to culture, back to the gap or otherwise between the military's requirement for, in its primary aim, for lethality, or at least the threat of lethality, for deterrence to take effect, and the society, which has become very disconnected from such things. So talk a little bit about that.
So I think that's probably always been the case to a degree. Kipling's poem, Tommy, about Tommy this and Tommy that, and all the things that Tommy does wrong and complaining about it until the drums begin to roll. And then it's, red-coated heroes, thanks very much for saving us. So I think, for an army and the other two services, there's always been an element of that. But I think you're right. Our challenge in the army, let's take the army as an example, but it's equally so in the other two services, is to take ordinary people from ordinary life and to equip them to do the most extraordinary things, which I been privileged to watch them do over 35 years. And that's not straightforward. And nor, therefore, should we be surprised when things go wrong in the news, or a cultural issue emerges, or a behavioural issue, which is always laid at the Army's door. But we recruit our people from society. So all the ills, behaviours, and nature of society that you see, of course, are reflected in its army. And we're not an army, although we impress our values and standards on our young people and hold them to it, which is why you often see things in the news, because we are disciplining people who transgress. But we don't try and suppress their characters like some armies or some nations do, to the point where they lose all individuality. We're very keen on that. But you're not wrong that the nature of society today is very much me, rather than, a sort of Kennedy-like view of what you can do for your country. But I never sense that we have a challenge with that in the armed forces. The challenge is getting enough quality people into the armed forces, which is a separate issue. But despite the fact that I took a bunch of young Scottish soldiers to Afghanistan, and lots of people said PlayStation generation, used to wearing trainers, not used to living rough, not used to being without their phones, not used to confronting danger on a daily basis like their forefathers who went to the trenches. Never had a problem with them. Never had a day when they weren't happy to go out the front gate. Never got asked, "Why are we here, sir? Why are we doing this? It's all a waste of time." And so, we've been doing it for 350 years, so I guess we're good at it. But nevertheless, the challenge is there, as you say, to impress the values and standards of the army that we want to have, that sufficiently reflects the society from which we take it, but also manages to maintain the fighting ethos in a very demanding and unpleasant environment, ultimately. And I think it was one of the Civil War generals, Grant, probably, who said, war is a violent and brutal and bloody business, and it takes brutal and bloody people to wage it. And that is at odds with a world of, D&I and equality and looking after self and all the rest of it. And so the army has the challenge of walking this line. What I would say, in 35 years of doing it, is the army has come a huge way since you and I commissioned in 1991 in good old Eaps Company, in a very positive way. When I think back to the Glaswegian Infantry Battalion I joined 35 years ago, compared to the one I commanded in 2008, and the army the battalions I have experienced since, we're in a much better place in terms of making people more welcome, a more inclusive workplace, but also a happier and more relaxed workplace. And that has slightly been part of my mission, I discovered by accident, to try and command bits of the army that were able to deliver operational success and be happy at the same time. But the diversity thing is interesting, and clearly, you can look at other bits of the world where it's going wrong, or where diversity is used almost as a sort of means of excluding non-members of that organisation, or undermining the ethos. And what we have to remember is that the army is not like a civilian organisation. Other two services the same. It's there to do something completely different, and it's given a unique, almost unique, stand fast, a handful of highly trained policemen, a unique mandate to legally take life on behalf of the nation. And that's an enormous responsibility. And so we've got to balance the role of the army, which is to fight and win the country's wars on land, with the requirement to be an equal opportunities employer, to treat the people who come to work for us in a pleasant, encouraging, warm, and enjoyable way, and to welcome everyone's diversity, but not to the point where it undermines that fighting ethos. And it's a challenge. But I think the army understands that. I'm very confident the army understands it. And I think we've come a hell of a long way in a long time in doing it.
That's really interesting for me, because you talk about over the 35 years you've been in uniform, there has been a profound change in expectations in society, even in the last 5 or 10 years. And there's a risk, of course, we treat what we read in the media to be universal, as opposed to what the media focuses on. And so there's an amplification bias in there for sure. But that's reassuring to hear that the army is actually adapting while staying true to its goal, actively adapting and even leading on some of these things. I saw recently the army's recently articulated culture, literally in the last few months, is now moving from what historically was quite a values-based narrative, teamwork, commitment, integrity, those types of things, which are vague, and in the end interpreted subjectively. They have to be by the nature of human experience, to more of a behavioral lens, which I find very interesting and highly pertinent, because you can manage behaviors much more actively. What's acceptable, what's not acceptable. What does this value look like in a behavioural term?
To be fair, I think the army has always had that. So it has its values, as you said. They're all sort of banners like loyalty, courage, discipline, respect for others, selfless behaviour. But it also has standards which are lawful, acceptable, and professional. And all soldiers are taught that those three standards have to be maintained. And that's maybe a more useful term. Yes. I mean, it is interesting what you say about the headlines. And I sort of mull on this occasionally. I suppose it reflects my earlier point that we're not like any other organisation. But if somebody who works for Walker's Crisps or BT or drives a Tesco delivery van gets in a fight in the pub in his time off in the evening and injures somebody, or gets done for drunk driving or kills somebody, the headlines don't say Tesco delivery driver arrested for murder. But if a soldier does that, even if it's done in his own time or on leave or off base, it always says, soldier does this or paras do this or whatever. So we always get labelled. That's because people aren't in the army, they are the army. But it is interesting that we do get judged to a higher standard. I'm probably pretty comfortable with that because we do hold our people to a higher standard.
There's a reciprocal relationship there, though, isn't it? Because you talk about the military's unique role, making it therefore unique from an organisation perspective, but it's also representing a society. So there's a reciprocal responsibility both to the role, but also to make sure that your representation of society in the way that Tesco delivery drivers or Walker's Crisps salespeople don't, right? They're not representing, and arguably off duty, they're not even representing their companies. So there's a sort of reciprocal responsibility, and I peripherally have been party to some conversations around this constant adjustment of how do we recognize, respond, and even lead on the way that the society is changing and expectations around diversity, inclusion, for instance, whilst at the same time making sure that we maintain or even build and improve our core role, our deterrence effect, and ultimately our ability to bring violence or defend the nations and win the land wars. It's a constant adjustment, a bit like sailing. You're constantly adjusting the sails, aren't you? Because society is moving.
Yes, and society can be fickle and responds to what's happening. So, the army was extremely popular at the height of the Afghanistan conflict because the population saw what we were doing and to a degree felt sorry for us, which we weren't necessarily keen on. We wanted support. We didn't want anyone feeling sorry for ourselves because we were, generally speaking, pretty pleased with, what we were getting up to. I think that the diversity thing is interesting because diverse teams perform better. That's a mantra we're all familiar with in this trade we're in. And there's abundant evidence to prove that's the case. There is an argument that at the lower levels of the army, if you want a section of 8 soldiers to storm an enemy machine gun position, or to climb into a trench and engage in hand-to-hand combat with a bunch of 6-foot Russian paratroopers, that diversity of thought, never mind origin or where you come from, but diversity of thought isn't necessarily a very helpful thing. I'm not sure I subscribe to that because I've commanded some quite diverse organisations with different people in who still perform superbly. I think the best description I heard of it is the Royal Marines have an expression, which is when somebody new joins the team, they have 2 questions. Are you any good and are you here to help? And if the answer to those 2 questions is yes, what colour you are, where you went to school, what you do in your spare time, and what your general orientation is could not be less important. We've got a difficult task. It's all hands to the pump. If you're here to help and you're good at what you do, fantastic. Everything else doesn't matter. And in that way, in some ways, the armed forces, I think, are an extraordinarily diverse organisation. You look at, what makes them up now. And I think that's absolutely something we can be proud of, and has changed over the course of my service to the good.
Significantly, I think. And I don't wish to split hairs, but for me, and we were having a conversation actually before you arrived, about that describes for me not an active bias towards diversity, but diversity is an outcome of that attitude. It's not necessarily inclusive, because if you're not any good, or you're not here to help, you're not welcome. So there's a distinction that I'm trying to draw more generally, not necessarily just in this conversation, that actually diverse teams tend to be more, or rather diversity blind organizations and teams are a product of a values and an outcome-based organization. But inclusion has limits and boundaries and standards, because actually you don't want certain types of people in the organization, or certain attitudes or certain abilities, because doing so will dilute the outcome that you're trying to. So I think there's a distinction, and I think I am splitting hairs a little, but I find the aggregation of diversity, equity, and inclusion into a DE&I agenda sometimes unhelpful, because it blurs those boundaries.
Couldn't agree more. You've got to be very careful about lumping the whole thing up into some sort of HR project that somebody gets given to make sure we're ticking a box, and truly understand who it is you want working for your organisation and what they bring to it, and then make sure that you're not unfairly disadvantaging those who meet the standard, but in all other regards might be different.
Absolutely.
So we're not really a single British Army, we're a series of regiments, and as you know, we all tend to join our CAP badges rather than the Army, whereas people join the Navy or the Royal Air Force. So it is a source of tension, but ultimately I think it's a positive tension. And the reason I say that is partly because it's the envy of every other army in the world, and it's a system we've had for over 350 years, and that helps, despite the fact we still insist on messing about with it. I was amazed that we felt the need to create a new regiment called the Rangers in the last SDSR, despite the fact we've got the oldest regimental system in the world. We still felt we needed a new regiment, which was odd. But the famous military historian, wonderful man who you'll have come across, Professor Richard Holmes, said, and there wasn't much about fighting that he didn't know, 3 things make soldiers fight: tradition, training, and each other. And the regimental system, as we have it, certainly attends to 2, if not 3 of those in a unique way that I think binds our troops together in the most demanding operational circumstances that one could face a battlefield, in a way that history has proved extremely effective.
Identity.
So you're right, there are tensions, but overall I think they're positive ones.
All right. Identity and meaning, it is at the heart of all functioning organizations. I want to talk about sort of your own personal leadership philosophy and learnings, and maybe I want to start that. I want to come back to something you mentioned and I didn't pick up on, but I want to pick up on now, that point around to use the jargon positive psychology, but what you actually talked about was actually happiness. And that's surprising to hear someone at the end of a 35-year career commanding organizations talk about putting happiness at the center of it. So maybe let's use that. So talk more about that. Where does that come from? That's not consistent with the philosophy and the underlying assumptions in the Army going back 35 years, but clearly society it is now. One of our previous podcast guests was Anthony Selden, and he talks a lot about positive psychology. So I'd like to understand in the context of your leadership and the military, what role does that play?
I'm glad you asked me about that, because it's really important to me. It's almost my sort of, if you ask me to define one particular thing about my leadership journey and my very fortunate trip commanding all of these formations, it's that determination to prove that you can achieve operational excellence, as I've done in some very high-performing organisations, like 16 Brigade and others. I didn't achieve it, the team achieved it, I just happened to be there getting all the credit. But also to be happy, and it's a rather unmilitary word. But the first time I sat down to think about my leadership style was when I was a young major and I was given command of a rifle company in my battalion. It was my first sort of big independent command. And that's the first time I thought, right, I better sit down. I say big, 100 people. Sit down and think about how I'm going to do this. What is Nick Borton's leadership philosophy that I'm going to lead these 100 jocks with? And I hit on 3 things that I thought were important, which is disciplined, always important with Scottish soldiers, disciplined, happy, and operationally ready. And weirdly, every time I then got another command, faintly to my surprise and certainly to my wife's, I sat down to craft my new command strategy for division or corps or brigade or wherever it was. And I came back to disciplined, happy, and operationally ready. When I got to 16 Air Assault Brigade, which, as you know, is all the paras, and the deputy commander, who was a parachute regiment officer, said, "Sir, you can't possibly have happy. This is 16 Brigade. We're airborne.
Yes.
We are nails.
We don't do happy."
So I sort of grudgingly said, "Well, you can call it motivated if you want, but I'm still about making sure people are happy." Now, soldiering on occasion is a grim, grim business, and there are some dark, stilly watches of the night, which can be pretty miserable. And some difficult things you get asked to do on occasion. But broadly speaking, we all do it because it's a vocation, it's a calling, it's what we want to do. It's what I always wanted to do all my life and been lucky to do it. And without a shadow of a doubt, my experience shows me that people are better soldiers if they're enjoying their soldiering, not least because they don't get paid enough not to enjoy it. And we used to get told, leadership's not a popularity contest, men. You've got to, that was the days when it was only men. You know, you're here to like it or lump it, and you dish out the orders and everyone was on board, otherwise they're history. That was the kind of traditional approach. And of course, in this day and age, with a small volunteer army where people have got other things to do, there's a talent crisis, not just in UK and defence, but across the whole of Europe, possibly the globe, for high-class talent, volunteering to do these things. It slightly is a popularity contest, because if you treat everybody under your command or everybody who works in your factory or in your business miserably, they'll all leave and go and do something else. Young people today aren't, right, I'm joining the army, I'm going to do it for 30 years and that's it, probably like I was, come hell or high water. They want to enjoy what they do for a career and they want to feel valued and get stuck into it. So I'm absolutely convinced it's possible to deliver excellence in whatever one's field of endeavour is, and at the same time, bar the odd moment when you've got to probably, and occasionally in soldiering, you have to look people in the eye and say, right, this is what we're doing, and it's not going to be pleasant. But broadly speaking, people should go into work with a skip in their step. And I say to all young officers who join my regiment, 2 things. Firstly, always go into work as a leader with a smile on your face and a skip in your step. Because if you go into work and visibly enjoy what you do, then everybody around you will respond to that and enjoy it too. And the second thing is, and second nature to you and I who grew up with it, serve to lead, is put your soldiers first. And if your soldiers or your employees know that you've got their best interests at heart and not your own career interests, then there's nothing they won't do for you. Mm. And if you crack those 2 things, you've nailed military command. And I say to COs, and it's interesting you mentioned Sir Anthony Selden, who said as a headmaster he went around smiling. I say to all commanding officers who come and see me before they take over command, I say, dead easy. Let the team get on with running a battalion. You just walk around, talk to people and smile. That's all you need to do. And then you'll have a happy battalion. It'll be a high-performing battalion.
So that last point was the thought that was emerging as you were talking about that. And it is profoundly different to the sort of military stereotype that exists. So I'm pleased we're talking about it. There's 2 aspects to it, and they're not necessarily... I want to draw the distinction between the 2 to see whether one applies or both apply. One is to your point around if people aren't happy and they're not enjoying the experience, they won't stay. So in other words, it's a hygiene factor in some ways. And the other part of what you're saying, just that you finished on, is actually organizations perform better if they're enjoying what they're doing, which is a performance premium, which is different to the hygiene factor. Right?
It is. And the hygiene factor is almost an additional point, I suppose.
So the main point is that you're going to get better performance if people are enjoying it.
No question. And it's the right thing to do, I think. But my experience is that people did stay, but they performed much better and we had much more successful teams and people are prepared to dig out more. It's the old thing about, do you clock off at 5 o'clock, ding, ding, and do the bare minimum, or do you dig out blind for that leader because he inspires you or she inspires you and you want to help them and do it for the team? The Navy have an expression, a happy ship's a fishing ship. efficient ship, not efficient ship.
You said that a bit too quickly.
Exactly, an efficient ship.
Yes.
There's a few efficient ships
Yes.
as well. So it's not new thinking, but I think the traditional military environment can be one. And I see it with other armies, if I'm honest. So the British Army is, again, in some ways, we put ourselves down in this country a lot. And there's lots of bad news in the press about the armed forces and the state of preparedness. But whenever I look at any other army in the world, and I have worked with lots of armies all around the world, I always come back and take comfort from the men and women we've got in our armed forces and what they do and how motivated and professional they are. And the command climate in other armies almost universally is not like the British one of challenging. Our young officers and soldiers are brought up as we were to challenge authority, to question. And I think, command styles, inherent style of leadership, it must be you. Of course, it develops because the more you get to exercise it, the more you learn. I made horrendous mistakes and even learning, right until the last few weeks in command. But you'll be pleased to hear. But so it's genuinely you, but it does evolve at the levels. So junior leadership is very much follow me. You can look at 30 men or women you're commanding and say, follow me. You can look at a tactical problem, which if you're a platoon commander, is going to be a straightforward one. And you don't need to spend much time discussing it with everybody. You can make your assessment, give your orders, follow me, everybody, and off you go. When you're commanding a division of 25,000 people or a corps of 80,000 people with a staff of 500 people, you can't be across all of that detail. And however talented one might be, present company excluded, it's just not possible to do that. So you've got to rely on the team. So I've found, and it's actually, I think, a neat leadership tip, but people respond much better if they're included in the decision-making process. So in the old days, generals would say, confronted with a problem, would say, right, men, wrongly, this is what we're going to do. Much better to say, right, team, what do you think we should do? And I always start with every discussion now when they say, right, General, this has come in, we've got these orders, we've got to do this, we've got to get to here, we've got to do this complex problem. Everyone looks at you. I say, right, what are we going to do about that then? And it's a much better start to the conversation. Then everyone goes, oh, they want to know what I think. Now, it might be that being the most experienced leader in whatever field you're in, you're going to get to the answer quicker than everybody else, not because you're more talented, but because you've just done it more often. Soldiering is a very largely an activity based on experience. And therefore, if you're the corps commander, you've got more experience than everyone else in the corps because nobody else has been a corps commander. So it's very quick to get to that solution. Don't come out with that solution. Wait and see what everyone else comes up with. Ask them for their view. Ask them to produce a solution. 80% of the time, well, it might well be better than yours, or 80% of the time it would probably be quite similar to yours, in which case, great, go with it. And then they walk away saying, great, the boss picked my plan. Now, the boss might have decided to do your plan 10 minutes before you even knew it was your plan because he knew it was the right answer. But don't jump to do that because nothing disenfranchises people, especially young people, as much as not being involved in the team endeavour and not being asked for their contribution, just being told what to do. And the danger with the armies is you just get told what to do the whole time and it's really boring. Whereas if you get asked to contribute to the problem and chip in, then it's much more rewarding and you get a much better product and everybody's much happier.
Ultimately, you're getting people thinking. Right?
Exactly.
As opposed to just taking directions.
And it's a great mistake to think just because you're the commander or the CEO or the chief operating officer that you've got the best idea or the best brain in the room. That is the height of intellectual arrogance. And there's plenty of generals who do think that, I'm sure. I've always been surprised that I've got to where I was, but more importantly, very clear that I did so because I was able to use the brains of the people around me supporting me and supporting the endeavour that we're all engaged in. And it's a fatal error to think that you're the most intelligent person with the best idea.
Well, the old saying is, if you think you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is that unusually, outside the militaries, you've essentially been in one organisation for your entire professional career.
Yep.
And yet, that command experience that you've talked about, from leading 30 soldiers to leading a corps of 80,000 people, requires a profoundly different leadership style, allocation of attention, thought process as you go through. Now, that what you've just talked about in terms of enabling others to think within your organization is probably a perpetual enabler for that transitions. But can you talk a little bit about that shift between, and it's often oversimplified into tactical, operation, and strategic, but it is oversimplified. There is inherent in a career such as yours a need to constantly reinvent. How have you done that in terms of maintaining a professional continuity and yet also constantly reinventing? I'm interested in unpicking that a little bit.
It's a great question, and I say that because I'm not sure I've ever consciously thought about that. So it might have just happened by accident. But if I think about it now, I think the first thing is back to thine own self be true. So, those thoughts I sat down as a young major to say, this is how Nick Borton does leadership, I think it's been my constant thread. Luckily, it's worked out. I think the broader bits, of course, the higher up you go, the broader the span. It's more important to be a polymath and more important to bring in, to have the skill, I guess the boardroom skill to sit around a table and bring everybody's views and capabilities and inject in, because you can't be a master of all. And that increases dramatically the higher up you go.
Yes.
Boring, sorry for the non-military to use military terms, I suppose, but, as a company commander in charge of 100 people with some, significant weapons, but it's not a very complicated thing. Actually, an infantry battalion is not a very complicated thing. So a capable commanding officer, and I've seen some capable commanding officers doing it, can run the whole thing inside their head. I say to them, don't run the whole thing inside your head. I know you can do it, but the rest of your support team are just twiddling their thumbs. And if you get killed, then nobody knows what's happening. So use the team around you. And I just think you get better at that as you go on. And I think I've got better at as I've gone on. And the other thing is, don't feel if you're in charge that you've got to be right all the time. And this is a fatal military flaw, that in some way your sort of authority or rank is undermined if you're seen to be wrong or be corrected. So you'd never want to be in an army where seniors don't get corrected. Luckily in the British Army, our juniors tell us that we're wrong the whole time. And if you grew up in a Scottish infantry regiment, your soldiers tell you you're an idiot constantly. So that's very healthy. Cultural challenge is so important, albeit as long as it's directed towards supporting the endeavour rather than undermining it. So don't be afraid to, and I see it with people who I think lack confidence in the level they're at if they've been over promoted.
It's fragility of ego usually.
Correct. Yeah. And then they're anxious to be, to talk over people in case anyone says, "Oh, hang on, sir, that's a rubbish idea. It'll never work." And then you look like, "Oh, don't worry about that. You should just say, oh yeah, good point. Thanks very much." Or point out when you're wrong. And again, everyone will breathe a sigh of relief and go, right, thank goodness. We can just come up with making a good plan and trust that we're putting the boss in the best possible decision to make that decision, the best possible position to make that decision. Because ultimately, as a commander, a boss, you're there for one thing, which is to make that critical good decision when that moment comes. Up to that point, you need all the help you can possibly get because you'll make a better decision. So don't worry about being wrong, I think is an absolutely key point. Can
I just pick up on that challenge point? Because for non-military people, that they will immediately be surprised and possibly even skeptical about the level of challenge that's embedded within such a hierarchical system. And yet, in the work that we do with organizations across different sectors, almost all of them are seeking greater levels of challenge, greater levels of direct communication, because most organizations tend towards conflict aversion outside the military. So how do you inculcate that? Because it's very interesting, because there are a few organizations, as you talked about, as well structured or as indeed hierarchical as the army or the military. You've got everything from flags, from rituals like saluting to rank slides and calling people sir. So it's got inbuilt multi-generational hierarchy built into it. And yet, as you've just talked about, there are organic high levels of challenge. So talk where does that come from, but also how can organizations
It's very interesting. That? So I'm not meant to ask you questions, but I bet
you can ask me questions.
Your broader experience of civilian industry, business and life, my bet is there's a lot more dictatorial running of things
Yes.
and direction, a lot more diktat and a lot less mission command than we've grown up in the army in many, many cases. I've seen it myself in a fraction of insights I've had to business and civilian life.
Yes.
And exactly as you say, contrary to what people think, which is battalion by the right quick march and 500 people start marching, which of course there's an element of, on the battlefield orders need to be followed. But actually, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that they shouldn't be followed. So Stanley McChrystal, US General Special Forces Commander, famously said, when you get off the helicopter on the objective, if you find we've given you the wrong orders, execute the right orders. Frederick the Great said, it's the duty of every officer to disobey orders when they're wrong. And so we've all grown up with that. And as I say, if you command an unruly bunch of Glaswegians like me who for whom back chat is a inherent character. I remember commanding my first foot patrol in Northern Ireland, about which I was clearly nervous. And I knew what I was meant to do. I knew what the platoon should have done in terms of its tactics, but I lacked my own confidence to command it. So I made a simpler plan, a less good plan, and I briefed the platoon on that. And immediately a hand went up at the back, and I said, yes, Fusilier Jones. And he said, sir, wouldn't it be much better if we did A, B, C, D, E, F, G? And all the other jocks said, yes, sir, that'd be a much better plan, which was the plan we should have done. Yes. And I thought, oh, well, this is going really well, my first set of operational orders, and the entire platoon are now disputing whether we should do it. And I said, yes, it would be better. Do you think we could do that? And all the jocks said, yes, sir, of course we can, no problem. Absolutely fine. And
you won them over in that moment.
Well,
probably, right?
Possibly. They certainly followed me for that patrol. So we did it. I'm not sure whether they were leading the patrol or I was, but I said, okay, if you think we can do it, let's do it. And we did it. And, so from my first stages, one's used to being challenged. Flying is an area where even if you're not the senior pilot or you're the co-pilot, if you see something going wrong or you see the aircraft commander make a mistake, you're duty bound to challenge that in order to prevent a disaster. So I think we grow up with it. And as you say, people looking in just see orders, marching, drill, or they watch Hollywood movies, which is a very, poor example of, true military leadership, and don't realize in a funny sort of way what a very democratic and sort of hierarchical organizations. Shackleton had a great line, which is, not everyone has equal status, but everyone is treated equally and treated with equal respect.
It's a nice philosophy.
And I think that sums up, the military environment that we grew up in.
This is a nice opportunity for me to ask you the collective noun question. So you talked a lot about the sort of your experiences at different levels about leading military formations. If you were to characterize that experience in the collective noun, whether it's mammals, fish, whatever, what would you use?
Yes, unfortunately, you gave me plenty of time to think about this, so I just thought about that instead of saying anything intelligent to you during the course of the interview. So the obvious ones, Labradors, well-trained, well-bred.
Biddable, though?
Biddable.
A little bit.
I've seen plenty of young officers who you could describe as a bunch of chimps. But I thought, unusually, magpies. Magpies come in tribes or mischief of magpies.
Mischief, that's right.
So magpies look the same because they're all got the same uniform, they're all black and white, and they operate in gangs, tribes. So on the face of it, they look disciplined and coherent in a single organisation. They do actually work in teams, corvids, but they're also individuals, and they all misbehave, and there's an element of mischievous about them. And remember I said earlier, job of the officer is to steal a march. Well, magpies, of course, steal things, can be devilish, cunning, and tricky. So
very clever. Yes.
I think magpies is the sort of unruly, thinking for yourself, slightly devilish, slightly cunning, put one over on the enemy, but all part of a tribe and a team ultimately, analogy that I would pick.
A mischief of magpies. That's very good. That's a new one. With the swan is being fought over by both gin makers and ballet dancers, but no one's claimed the magpie. So very good. So last question, Nick, and I have warned you about this, so hopefully you've given it as well a little bit of thought. It's an extraordinary leadership journey you've described, and we have slightly hopped about from leading patrols in Northern Ireland to leading multinational coalitions at corps level. So it's difficult to sort of pick a uniformity over the 35 years, but if you were to choose a song that encapsulates your leadership journey over the last 35 years, what would it be?
I'm not sure I could pick a song per se.
You have to. We've got a playlist that we're building up.
So I'll give you a piece of music. So the obvious
Yes.
one to pick would be a pipe tune, because I spent my lifetime in a Scottish infantry battalion. The pipes are the theme tune of what all Scottish battalions do, but that's a bit obvious. So going back to my previous point about the magpies, the bit of music I'd leave you with is the overture to The Thieving Magpie by Rossini, which you should be familiar with. So I'm going to catch you out now, because it's a wonderful bit of music.
Yes.
It starts as a military march because it's celebrating a war hero coming back from the wars. So it starts with drums and of course, military man, I love a military march. But actually then as it goes on, the melody becomes very unmilitary and skits about like the magpies as the magpie comes in and is sort of devilish and mischievous and fun and jolly. And for me, that sums up the discipline of the profession of arms and the profession of soldiering. But actually underneath that discipline is a sense of fun, a sense of people working together and enjoying themselves in an important endeavor and working for each other and putting each other first. And the music really reflects that at the end. Finally, of course, it's the slow march of our mutual corps, the Army Air Corps, which I know you knew, Charlie.
Of course, I knew that.
There we go. That's a bit of music I'll leave you with.
That's lovely. Structure and order and humanity and chaos. Probably describe.
And a bit of fun, lots of fun.
And in amongst it, fascinating. Well, I have really enjoyed this. I have a feeling we could talk for another hour or more. And we haven't talked about your mastering the hover in a helicopter more recently, which I'll spare you the
less
trials
said about that. Yeah,
but having been near neighbours as we went through the very earliest part of training 35 years ago, and of course I was unsuited for a senior military career, but I have watched your career over the years, and to be able to interview at the close of it, at this stage of your professional life, and unpick some of the lessons have been absolutely fascinating and hugely enjoyable. So thank you very much.
my absolute pleasure. Great to see you.